So my article discussed Too Close for Brain Comfort, and these researchers decided that they were going to go into a fourth grade science classroom, and they were going to study how the words affected the children's retention. For example, does anyone know what a stalagmite and a stalactite mean?
A stalagmite is one that it's in a cave that hangs from the ceiling, right? No, a stalactite hangs from the ceiling. A stalagmite is on the ground.
What about antigen and antibodies? Does anyone know what those mean?
Antibodies fight infections. Antigens, something with blood?
I don't know.
Oh.
I actually don't know. But they use these words. These words were on all the tests that fourth grade students needed to know. And they're difficult to understand. But the question was why? Why these words? And they studied that the words that have similar graphemes and affixes are more difficult for students to remember. Does anyone know what an affix is? A suffix or a prefix. So for example, stalagmite and stalactite, they both have the same prefix or beginning syllables, which is also onset. And antigens have the same thing, and antibodies. So they studied 400 students, and they had 3 different teaching methods. The first one, it was plain, write the vocab word down, and that's it. And you would review it over flashcards. I know I did that in high school and in middle school, and that's all I learned was vocab words. But there were 2 different types that they wanted to try, and it's called the generation effect and the production effect. From these words, what do y'all think generation effect would look like? We generate things, we produce things. So they wanted, they wanted to generate questions, to generate thinking. So they spent a lot of time focusing on how the vocab was used in real life. They would take the vocab and apply it and ask a lot of questions, and they wanted them to generate the definition. They wanted them to produce the definition. So they did a lot of critical thinking and real world problems about stalagmites and stalactites, because they couldn't answer the question if they didn't know the vocab. And then the second one was production effect, which was creating, which is a lot of fun. There's a lot of constructivism and thinking, cognitive thinking of interacting with it. So a lot of the ways that they taught it was through writing and drawing and making things. For example, with a stalagmite and a stalactite, they would use paper mache and create a cave, and they have their stalagmites and stalactites coming up, and they paint them. That way, the kids could have that visual representation, but it also is kinesthetic. You get to build with your hands and produce, which for some reason it lasts longer in your brain because you remember it. When we do projects in here and in other classes, it makes more sense when we do it. Once they did these, after about a month, they tested all the students to see well the students did. And they found those who just did the control way, it was average. Tests were good, they weren't good, depending on if the students study. But the generation and production effect their grades were always higher than the control group. No matter how hard the kid participated or tried, there's always going to be students who don't want to try or don't want to work on the homework. But what was interesting, over all 3 of the groups, the problem words were the ones that shared the same graphemes. And so they figured out that we do a lot of phonological awareness, but we don't do a lot of morphological awareness, which studies the different meanings. And they wanted to see how that would work, but sadly there's no research for morphological awareness, so they were like, we need to start studying this. And so this article was great to see how what we're learning is actually working in the classroom, but also to see that there could be a whole new technique that we could be using inside of the classroom, which is morphological awareness, which I thought was really interesting. So this article was published in 2013, so it's fairly recent, only about maybe 3 years, but it's still applicable for the classroom. And so what do y'all think of when you think of like morphological awareness? Like, does anyone know what that means?
That's understanding like the meaning of the word, like word formation and right?
Yes.
Because there's the morpheme, like the smallest unit of meaning.
Yes, so understanding how those meanings work together and how we can build off of them. So kind of like how we learn prefixes and suffixes, but to learn how when we combine certain letters and graphemes together that it makes words, and how we can use it in the classroom. Whereas phonological awareness, we're listening to the sounds, but they want us to teach not just the sounds and not just how to spell it, but to be able to look at a word and be able to see like, okay, too close. Like, how can I use T-O? I know that meaning of two, but there's an extra O, and trying to use those almost like context clues, except it's in one word, which is, I think, really cool, because it's like using critical thinking to figure out a word without having to look at words beside it or behind it. This one at the bottom pretty much talks about how many students they discussed and what the study was overall about. So it talks about how there were 400 students in 7th grade who were studying complex science vocabulary, and each teacher had to teach a different technique. And then we jump over to here, and it explains what the generation effect is and the production effect, and then it talks about the results and how they led the researchers to discover that morphemes were not studied or tested. And this one at the bottom pretty much says, like, why do we need to know this? Like, what's the overall point of having, different types of learning? And it was, not only do kids learn it better, but they get better grades, which helps us and helps us to see that the students are overall learning the material.